My son died on a Tuesday. They told me it was a car accident on a slick, rain-swept highway. A single car, a fiery crash. At my son's funeral, his wife, my daughter-in-law Jess, insisted on a closed casket. She said the accident was too severe that we should remember him as he was. But standing there beside that polished mahogany box, something felt wrong. A piece of the machinery wasn't aligned. Then at the graveside, as they lowered the coffin into the cold, damp earth, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. "Dad, I'm alive. That's not me in the coffin." If you're listening to my story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's intuition is never wrong. My name is Charles Henderson. I am 74 years old. For 42 of those years, I was a foreman at the Ford assembly plant just outside of Detroit. I'm a man who understands how things are built, and more importantly, how they fall apart. I can spot a faulty engine mount from 20 feet away, and I can hear a misaligned bearing in a crowded factory. I know the difference between the hum of a machine running right and the whine it makes just before it breaks down. At my son's funeral, all I could hear was the whine. Jess, my daughter-in-law, was playing the part of the grieving widow with a precision that would have made the engineers I worked with proud. Every tear was perfectly timed. Every choked sob was delivered with maximum effect. She stood beside me, clutching my arm, her delicate pale hand a stark contrast against the dark wool of my old suit. She was a picture of sorrow, but I saw the mechanics beneath the performance. Her grief was a well-oiled machine running too smoothly, too perfectly. There were no hitches, no stutters, none of the messy, unpredictable friction of real loss. The closed casket was the first part that didn't fit. David, my son, was a man who faced things head-on. He wasn't afraid of the truth no matter how ugly. The idea that he would want to be hidden away even in death felt wrong. It felt like a lie. Jess had explained it in a soft, trembling voice, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "It was the fire, Charles," she'd whispered. "The investigators, they said it's better this way." But her explanation felt hollow, like a press release, not the words of a heartbroken wife. As she held onto my arm, her grip just a little too tight, my mind drifted back to a phone call from David a month ago. He was a brilliant kid, a software engineer who had built his own cybersecurity firm from the ground up. He wasn't one to complain, but that day his voice was tight with a familiar kind of stress. "Dad," he had said, "Jess is pushing to sell the company. She met with some venture capital guys behind my back. She talks about the payout like it's already in her bank account. Something's not right." I told him it was just the stress of running a business, the natural friction between a husband and a wife with different ideas about the future. I told him to talk to her to work it out. "You're a good man, David," I had said. "You'll find the right path." Now standing in the oppressive silence of the funeral home, those words tasted like ash in my mouth. I had told him to fix a machine without realizing one of its core components was intentionally designed to make it fail. The service moved from the chapel to the cemetery. The air was cold with a dampness that seeped into my bones. The gray sky hung low over the perfectly manicured lawns, threatening a rain that never came. The minister spoke words about life and loss, but they were just background noise, the hum of distant machinery. My focus was on the coffin being lowered into the ground. A box, a sealed box they claimed held my son. Everything in me, every instinct honed by decades of looking for the flaw in the system, screamed that this was wrong. That's when I felt the vibration. I reached into my coat pocket, my old calloused fingers fumbling for the phone. It was a simple flip phone. David had bought me a smartphone for Christmas last year, but I preferred the satisfying click of this one. The screen lit up with a new message from a number I didn't recognize. My hands were steady as I opened it. 6 words that stopped the world from turning. "Dad, I'm alive. That's not me in the coffin." I didn't gasp. I didn't stumble. The shock hit me not like a wave, but like a current of pure cold electricity, snapping every one of my senses into sharp focus. The world went from a blurry, grief-stricken haze to high-definition clarity. I could see the tiny, insincere lines around Jess's eyes as she pretended to weep. I could hear the practiced hollow tone in the minister's voice. I could feel the lies settling over us all like a shroud. My thumbs, clumsy on the small keypad, moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. "David, "Where are you?" I typed. The seconds stretched into an eternity. I stared at the screen, willing it to light up again. Jess glanced at me. Her brow furrowed with what I now saw was irritation, not concern. She was probably annoyed that I wasn't playing my part in her little show. Then the phone vibrated again. A new message. "Can't say now they're watching. Just don't trust Jess." I clicked the phone shut. The sound was a final, definitive period on the life I had been living for the past 3 days. The grief was gone. It had been burned away by a cold, hard anger. I looked up from the grave, my eyes finding Jess across the open plot of earth. She was still dabbing at her eyes, but her performance had faltered. She saw the change in me. The stooped shoulders of a grieving old man had straightened. The vacant look of loss in my eyes had been replaced by the focused gaze of a foreman who had just found a critical failure on the assembly line, and I was going to find out who was responsible. The game had changed. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't go home after the funeral. Home was a quiet place filled with memories of my wife and the echoes of my son's laughter from when he was a boy. It was a place for grief, and grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. My mind was no longer a house of mourning. It had become a workshop. A problem had been presented, and I needed the right tools. I drove my old Ford pickup, the one David always told me to replace, through the city. Its engine hummed a familiar, steady rhythm. I knew every part of that truck, and I knew when something was wrong with it. Right now, everything was wrong with the world, and I needed a man who was as good with people as I was with machines. Frank Miller's office was on the second floor of a tired brick building downtown. The sign on the door just said, F. Miller Investigations. No glamour, no nonsense. Just like Frank. He was a private investigator now, but he and I went back 50 years back to a time when we wore different uniforms, and the problems we solved were a lot louder. He was sitting behind a steel desk, cluttered with files, a half-empty mug of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes sharp and assessing. He saw something in my face and straightened up immediately. He didn't offer condolences, he just waited. I walked over to his desk, took the flip phone from my pocket, and set it down between us. The click of the plastic on the wood was the only sound in the room. "Frank," I said, my voice as level as a freshly paved road. "I have a job for you. My son is alive and someone wants him dead." Frank didn't flinch. He didn't call me crazy. He looked from my face to the phone, then back to my face. He had been a detective long enough to know that the wildest stories were often the ones closest to the truth. He leaned forward, gesturing to the phone. "Show me." I opened the phone and showed him the 2 messages. He read them slowly, his lips a thin, tight line. He read them again. After a long silence, he pushed his chair back and stood up, walking over to the window that looked out onto the gray city street. "Jess," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's always the spouse." "That's the working theory," I replied. "But a theory isn't proof. You and I know that." He turned back to me. "What do you need from me, Charles?" "I need the truth," I said. "I need the official story taken apart piece by piece until we find the lie. I need to know everything about that crash. I need to know everything about Jess's finances. I need to know who that is in my son's grave." Frank nodded slowly, his mind already working, laying out the schematics of the investigation. "This is going to be expensive, Charles, and it's going to be dangerous. If they were willing to kill him once, they'll be willing to do it again, and they'll be willing to get rid of anyone who starts asking the wrong questions." "I buried an empty box today, Frank," I said. "Or worse, a box with a stranger in it. I don't care about the cost, and I'm too old to be scared." That was how our plan was born. In that dusty, quiet office, 2 old men drew up a blueprint for war. Our strategy was simple. I would be the inside man. My role was to play the part the world expected of me, the heartbroken, slightly confused old father. Grief would be my cover. I would get close to Jess, stay in her orbit, and watch. I would be a ghost in her machine, observing every gear, every pulley, listening for the slightest change in rhythm that would tell me where the system was breaking down. Frank would be the outside man. He would attack the official narrative. He'd use his old contacts at the police department, the coroner's office, and the DMV. He'd pull the financial records, the phone logs, the insurance policies. He would build a case on a foundation of facts while I gathered intelligence from behind enemy lines. We agreed on the rules of engagement. We would use burner phones, paying with cash. We would never speak about the case on our regular lines. We would meet in person in places no one would look twice at two old men having coffee. There would be no digital trail, no mistakes. Jess was smart and she was ruthless. We had to be smarter. As I left his office, Frank put a hand on my shoulder. "Be careful, Charles," he said. "Grief makes people careless. Don't let your performance become real." I just nodded. He didn't understand. The grief was real, but my focus was sharper. The next day, I called Jess. I pitched my voice low, letting it crack just enough. "Jessica," I said, using her full name. I was hoping I could come by the house to be around his things, you know." Her voice on the other end was syrupy sweet, dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, Charles, of course. The house is so empty without him. I could use the company." She thought I was a harmless old man looking for comfort. That was her first mistake. When I arrived at their house, a large modern place that had always felt cold to me, the first thing I noticed was the new security system. A brand new keypad was mounted by the door, and I could see the dark circles of new cameras tucked under the eaves of the roof. It was a fortress. It struck me as odd. If your husband just died in a tragic accident, is your first move to install a state-of-the-art security system? It felt less like a defense against intruders, and more like a cage to keep secrets in. Jess let me in, giving me a hug that felt like holding a bundle of cold wires. I played my part, walking slowly through the house, touching David's books, his favorite chair. All the while, I was scanning, observing. She was jumpy. Her phone buzzed constantly, and she would walk into another room to answer her voice, a low, urgent whisper. She wasn't a grieving widow. She was a project manager handling a crisis. I needed a reason to look around without raising suspicion. I used the skills that were second nature to me. In the kitchen, I pointed to the faucet. "That's got a bit of a drip, doesn't it?" I said, my voice weak. David always hated a dripping faucet. I could take a look if you don't mind. It would help to keep my hands busy." Jess waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Charles, don't worry about that. I'll call a plumber." No, I insisted gently. "Let me. It feels right." She finally agreed, probably deciding it was easier than arguing with a senile old man. She led me to the garage to get David's toolbox, and that's when I saw it. The toolbox was a large professional-grade rolling chest. David was meticulous. Every tool had its place outlined in foam, but now it was a mess. Wrenches were in the screwdriver slots, sockets were scattered. It was the work of someone who had been searching for something in a desperate hurry, someone who didn't know what they were looking for or how the system was supposed to work. My son would never have left his tools like this. It was a small detail, something a plumber or even Jess would never notice. But to me, it was a glaring error in the code, a crack in the foundation. Someone else had been in here. Someone was looking for something David had hidden. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my gut that my son had left me a message. The blueprint was in my head, and I had just found the first clue. Frank walked back to his desk and swept a stack of files into a drawer with one decisive motion. The cleared space wasn't just a surface to work on. It was a declaration. This case, my case, was now the only thing that mattered. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. I sat in the worn leather chair opposite him. For a moment, we were silent. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the quiet understanding between two men who had learned long ago that the most important work begins before a single word is spoken. It begins with a plan. In my old life at the plant, we called it a blueprint. You don't build a car by just throwing parts together. You start with a detailed schematic. You define every step, every station, every single role. That's what we did in that office. We drew the blueprint for taking back my son's life. "All right, Charles." Frank began, his voice low and methodical. "Let's build this from the ground up. We have two fronts, inside and outside. You are the inside man. Your cover is perfect because it's real. You are the grieving father. You are old. You are tired. You are heartbroken. You are invisible. People will say things around you they wouldn't say to a younger man. They will dismiss you. We are going to use that. Your job is to stay close to Jess. Accept her invitations. Go to the house. ask questions but make them sound like the confused ramblings of a man lost in his sorrow. "Oh, I can't seem to remember. Dear, did David have many friends at his new gym?" Or, "This is all so overwhelming. The lawyers, the insurance. David handled everything. You will be a sponge soaking up every detail, every name, every odd phone call, and you will report everything back to me." I nodded. I understood my role. In the factory, there was a position we called quality control. It was the guy who walked the line seemingly at random, checking the work. He looked for the smallest imperfections, the tiny mistakes that could lead to a catastrophic failure down the road. That was me now. I would be the quality control on Jess's lies. "I'm the outside man," Frank continued, scribbling notes on the pad. "I attack the official story. I'll start with the police report on the accident. I'll find out who the responding officers were who signed off on it. I'll check the coroner's office, see who did the identification and how. A dental record confirmation is only as good as the records you're given. I'll run the VIN of the burned-out car. Then I follow the money. I'll pull every financial statement I can get my hands on for Jess, see if she was in debt, see if there were any unusual transactions before or after the accident. And most important, the life insurance policy. How much was it? Who was the beneficiary? When was it last updated? Greed always leaves a paper trail, Charles. My job is to find it." Our roles were set. 2 sides of an assembly line, each with a specific task working towards a single finished product, the truth. But we needed rules. We were dealing with people who had at the very least faked a death. We had to assume they were capable of anything. "Communication," I said. "We can't use our regular phones." Frank was already ahead of me. "Way ahead of you," he grunted, pointing to a locked cabinet. "I've got a couple of burner phones in there. We pay cash, use them only to talk to each other, and ditch them in a week. We never meet here or at your house again. Public places only. A diner, a park bench, the library. Places with plenty of people but no one paying attention. And we never ever mention this to anyone. Not a soul. As far as the world is concerned, I'm just an old friend helping you with the estate paperwork. Understood?" "Understood," I said. The plan was clean. It was logical. It was a solid piece of engineering. There was a path forward now, a series of steps I could take. The helplessness that had threatened to swallow me whole was gone, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a man with a job to do. I was no longer just a grieving father. I was an operative. And my first mission was to walk back into the lion's den. The phone felt heavier than usual in my hand. I had to get into that house, but I had to do it on her terms. I took a deep breath, picturing a man bowed by age and loss, and dialed her number. When she answered, I let a slight tremor enter my voice. "Jessica," I said, pausing as if the name itself was a painful effort. "It's Charles. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Her voice came back coated in a thick layer of feigned sympathy. "Oh, Charles, never. How are you holding up?" I ignored the question. "I was just thinking," I said slowly. "There are some old photo albums of David when he was a boy. I think they're stored in the garage. I was hoping I could come by and pick them up. It would mean a lot to me right now." There was a brief pause on her end. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, weighing the risks against the need to maintain her performance. The grieving father-in-law was a crucial part of her story. "Of course, Charles," she finally said. "Whenever you'd like. The house is so quiet. It would be good to see a friendly face." An hour later, I pulled my truck up to their house, and the first thing I saw confirmed I was in enemy territory. A new security system. It wasn't a subtle upgrade, it was a declaration. A new gleaming keypad was mounted next to the front door, and the dark, unblinking eyes of several new cameras stared down from under the eaves. A foreman knows you don't reinforce a factory after the product is already shipped. You build a fortress when you're protecting something valuable inside, or when you're terrified of something getting in. With David gone, what could she possibly be protecting? Or was it that she was terrified of the truth getting out? Jess opened the door, her face a carefully constructed mask of sorrow. I played my part, stooping my shoulders, keeping my eyes downcast. I walked into the house that my son's hard work had paid for, and I felt like an intruder. She hovered nearby as I moved through the living room, her presence a constant nervous hum. I could see she was jumpy, her eyes darting to her phone every few seconds. She wasn't a widow settling into a quiet house of memories. She was a sentry on high alert. "The albums are in the garage, I believe," I said, my voice soft. "In the big plastic bins on the shelves." She nodded, leading the way. The garage was David's sanctuary. It was always clean, always organized. As Jess flicked on the light, my eyes immediately went to his toolbox. It was a large, professional-grade rolling chest. David was my son in every way, especially in this one. A place for everything, and everything in its place. Sockets arranged by size, wrenches hung in perfect order, screwdrivers set in their foam slots like soldiers on parade. But not today. Today it was a scene of chaos. The top drawers were slightly ajar. I could see from across the room that wrenches were thrown in with pliers, sockets were scattered. It was the work of a brute force search. The work of someone looking for something in a panic, someone who didn't understand the system they were violating. My son would have rather cut off his own hand than leave his tools in such a state. This was a wound, a desecration. It was the clearest message I could have received. Someone had been looking for something David had hidden. And the frantic mess of it all told me one more thing, a crucial thing that sent a surge of cold hope through my veins. They hadn't found it. The next few days were a masterclass in patience. I played the part of the grieving father, a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. I'd call Jess, my voice a quiet, mournful thing, and ask her simple, harmless questions. She'd answer with a practiced, weary sympathy, her words like smooth, polished stones offering no grip, no real information. But I was gathering intelligence in other ways. I was listening to the silences, the hesitations, the topics she quickly changed. Every conversation was a diagnostic test, and every one of them told me the machine was running badly. On the fourth day, my burner phone vibrated. It was Frank. Library history section, 1 hour. I found him in a dusty aisle hidden behind shelves of forgotten wars. He didn't look up from the book he was pretending to read. He just spoke, his voice a low rumble. "I ran the preliminary checks," he said. "The official story is a lemon Charles, a complete lemon fresh off the factory floor with a cracked frame." He slid a thin file across the table. "First, the police report. It's clean. Too clean. Signed off by a rookie cop who's only been on the force for 6 months. The whole thing reads like a script." My eyes scanned the pages. Vague descriptions, no mention of skid marks, a timeline that felt just a little too convenient. "The vehicle," Frank continued, tapping a line on the report. "The VIN number they pulled from the wreckage is registered to David's car, all right. But my guy at the DMV ran a deeper check. The VIN plate itself had irregularities. It's like they welded a new number onto an old frame. It's a trick used by professional car thieves. It's sloppy work if you know what to look for. Sloppy work. I understood that. It was the mark of someone arrogant, someone who assumes no one will ever bother to look under the hood. And the identification," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That's the rotten core of it all," Frank said, flipping a page. "Coroner confirms ID based on dental records. Standard procedure. Except the records weren't from Dr. Evans, David's dentist, for the last 20 years. They were faxed over from a new private clinic. A place Jess visited for the first time 2 months ago. You don't change a trusted supplier for a critical part without a damn good reason, Charles. She was setting this up. She was building the lie long before the accident ever happened." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of cold, calculated betrayal. But Frank wasn't done. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. "And then there's this," he said, sliding a single bank statement across the table. "I saw the transaction immediately. It was a wire transfer for $50,000. Sent the day before the crash," Frank confirmed, "to a holding company in Estonia, a company that specializes in untraceable cybersecurity services. She wasn't just planning an accident, Charles. She was planning a heist." I left the library with a cold fire burning in my chest. Jess wasn't just a grieving widow. She wasn't just an unfaithful wife. She was a professional, a saboteur, and she had underestimated me. That evening, as I sat in my quiet kitchen, the burner phone vibrated again. It was a message from David, 3 short words. "The old workbench, Project 68. My breath caught in my throat. Project 68. It wasn't a project, it was a promise. It was the 1968 Ford Mustang I had bought as a rusted-out shell when David was 15. For 28 years it had been our common ground. We'd spent countless weekends in my garage side by side, covered in grease, slowly bringing that beautiful machine back to life. It was more than a car. It was a testament to a bond built not on words, but on the shared work of our hands. I walked out to my garage, the familiar smell of oil and old steel a comfort. The Mustang sat under a dusty tarp, a sleeping giant. I went to the old wooden workbench that had been my father's. It was scarred with the history of 3 generations of Henderson men. I ran my hand along the underside until I felt it. A small, almost imperceptible seam in the wood. David and I had built the hidden compartment years ago, a secret place to keep valuable parts. My fingers found the hidden latch. A section of the wood swung down on silent hinges, and inside, resting on a bed of soft cloth, was a military-grade encrypted hard drive and a small, rugged satellite phone. It wasn't a clue. It was an entire arsenal. I called Frank. "I have something," I said. "Bring your best gear. Meet me at your office. Back door." An hour later, we were huddled in his office, the blinds drawn, the only light coming from his computer monitor. Frank using a piece of decryption software he probably shouldn't have had worked on the hard drive. It took him 20 minutes of silent, focused typing. Then with a quiet click, a single folder appeared on the screen. Its name was Janice. We opened it, and the full, horrifying truth spilled out. It wasn't a collection of random files. It was a meticulously organized case file. There were video logs from David, his face strained but resolute, recorded in the dead of night. He spoke directly to the camera, to me. "Dad, if you're seeing this, it means I was right," he began. "Jess is working with someone. They're not just after my money, they're after my work. They want Janice." Janice was the name of his proprietary security algorithm, a revolutionary piece of code that was about to make his company a titan in the tech world. The drive contained everything: copies of emails between Jess and her lover, a rival tech CEO named Alistair Finch, transcripts of their phone calls recorded by David's own security software. Their plan was laid bare. They weren't just going to steal the algorithm. They were going to kill David. Have Jess inherit the company as the grieving widow, and then sell the code to a foreign power for hundreds of millions of dollars. The car crash was meant to be the final act. David had discovered their plan just days before they were going to execute it. He didn't have time to go to the police. They were too powerful, their connections too deep. So he did what he had always done. He engineered a solution. He laid a trap of his own, faked his death, and escaped. This hard drive was his insurance policy. It was his voice from beyond the grave he was never in. We sat there in the dark, the glow of the monitor illuminating the terrible truth. The rage I felt was so pure, so cold, it was almost peaceful. The blueprint of their crime was now in my hands, and I was about to use it to tear their world down to the foundations. The satellite phone felt alien in my hand, a cold, dense piece of military-grade hardware. It didn't ring, it buzzed with a low, urgent hum. I answered. David's voice was clear with no static, no echo. It was as if he were in the next room. There was no time for sentiment. We were past that. This was the final phase of the operation. He spoke in the same direct, logical tone he used when explaining a complex piece of code to me. "Dad," he said, "it's time to set the trap. The boardroom at the office is a smart room. Everything is connected. The screen, the network, the security. It's my system. I designed it. It's a digital fortress, and I still hold the master key. You need to get Jess and her partner in that room. The transfer of corporate assets requires a formal board resolution. That's the bait." I understood. This wasn't just about a confession. This was about shutting them down completely. "What's the trigger?" I asked. "The meeting itself," David replied. "The moment the company's lawyer attempts to execute the transfer of my intellectual property from his terminal in that room, the Janus protocol will activate. It's a digital dead man's switch I built months ago. It will sever their access, lock them out permanently, and send an alert with all the evidence directly to a contact I have at the FBI's cybercrime division. But they have to be there. The system needs to verify their physical presence to spring the trap." "I'll get them there," I said. The call ended. I was no longer just a father seeking justice. I was the operator, the one who would set the gears of my son's intricate machine in motion. The first call was to the estate lawyer, a man named Davies. I put on the voice I had been practicing, the voice of a man adrift in a sea of grief and confusion. "Mr. Davies," I began, letting my voice waver. "It's Charles Henderson. I am so lost with all this business. Jess keeps talking about the company, the board. I want to get it over with. I want to honor my son's legacy and make sure everything is handled the way he would have wanted." I let out a long, weary sigh. "Jess thinks we should have a formal meeting to read the will and transfer control. I think she's right. Can we do it as soon as possible at the company headquarters?" It feels like the right place to do it. Davies, a man who smelled money and tragedy, agreed immediately. An excellent idea, Mr. Henderson. A decisive move to ensure a smooth transition. I'll arrange it for Friday. My next call was to Jess. When I told her the meeting was set, her voice was a symphony of feigned sympathy and real greed. "Oh, Charles, that's a wonderful idea," she cooed. "It will be so difficult, but it's what David would have wanted, to put this business behind us so we can all start to heal." I could hear the triumphant smile in her voice. She thought she was just days away from a 9-figure payday. She thought the game was over. She had no idea she was about to willingly walk onto the factory floor just as I was about to pull the master switch. Frank and I met one last time at a noisy diner. "They're in," I told him. "Friday, 10 a.m. He simply nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "My FBI contact is ready," he said. "They'll be waiting for my call." Friday morning was clear and cold. I wore the same dark suit I had worn to the funeral. It felt fitting. It was in its own way another burial. Frank picked me up and we drove to the gleaming glass tower that housed my son's company. We were announced as family of the deceased, and a silent assistant led us to the main boardroom on the top floor. The room was exactly as I had imagined, a monument to cold, hard success. A long black granite table sat under a futuristic light fixture. One entire wall was a seamless pane of glass offering a god's eye view of the city below. The opposite wall was a giant dark screen. It felt like a room where fates were decided. Frank and I took our seats at the far end of the table, two old relics in a world of tomorrow. Then she arrived. Jess swept into the room, not like a widow, but like a queen taking her throne. She was flanked by her lover, Alistair Finch, the rival CEO, and two sharp-looking lawyers. They were radiating an aura of victory. Jess nodded curtly at me, a flicker of pity in her eyes for the poor old man she had so easily deceived. "Charles," she said, "thank you for coming. Let's make this as painless as possible." They took their seats at the head of the table, the seat that had been my son's. Mr. Davies began the meeting, his voice droning on through the legal formalities. My heart was a steady, heavy piston in my chest. I watched Jess, her eyes gleaming, her fingers drumming impatiently on the granite. Davies arrived at the final item on the agenda. "And now," he said, "we will execute the formal transfer of all corporate assets and intellectual property, including the Janus algorithm, to the designated heir and new CEO, Jessica Riley Henderson." He turned to his laptop to begin the digital transfer. This was the moment. I cleared my throat. The sound was small, but it cut through the sterile air of the room. "Excuse me," I said. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from annoyance to surprise. "Before we sign anything," I continued, my voice calm and steady, "there is one last thing, a final message from my son. I think the board has a right to see it." Jess laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Charles, please. This isn't the time for sentimental home movies." "I insist," I said, my gaze unwavering. "As the father of the founder, I believe I have that right." The lawyer, Mr. Davies, looked uncomfortable. He was legally bound. "It is unusual," he stammered, "but I see no procedural harm." Jess and Alistair exchanged a look of fury, but they were trapped. Frank, without a word, stood up and connected the encrypted hard drive to the room's main console. He hit play. The giant screen on the wall flickered to life. It was David's face, tired but determined, looking out at us from his secret video diary. He began to speak. He laid out the entire conspiracy, his voice calm and factual. He spoke of the affair. He detailed their plan to steal his life's work. He showed copies of their emails, transcripts of their calls. The color drained from Jess's face. Alistair started shouting at the lawyer to stop the feed. "This is inadmissible. This is a violation." But it was too late. As they were shouting, the video on the screen suddenly died. It was replaced by a live, high-definition feed. It was David, not a recording. He was live. He sat in a simple, clean room looking directly into the camera. He looked directly at them. The room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. "Hello, Jess. Hello, Alistair," my son said, his voice echoing through the boardroom's speakers. "Surprised to see me?" Jess let out a small, strangled gasp. "It's over," David continued. "By attempting to access the company's core assets from this room, you have just triggered the final Janus security protocol. You sprang the trap yourselves." As he spoke, every screen in the room, the main monitor, their laptops, their phones flashed bright red. 2 words appeared in huge block letters: access denied. Below them, a second line scrolled across the screens: system lockdown initiated. Intellectual property secured permanently. David's face on the screen gave a sad, weary smile. "You can't steal what you can't touch," he said. "Checkmate." At that exact moment, the sleek glass doors of the boardroom slid open. Frank, who had quietly positioned himself by the door, held it open. 2 men and a woman in dark suits with FBI credentials entered the room. The lead agent looked at Jess and Alistair, whose faces were masks of pure, horrified disbelief. "Jessica Riley Alistair Finch," the agent said, her voice calm and professional. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and corporate espionage." I just sat there at the end of the long table and watched the machine they had built with lies and greed come to a grinding final halt. I had done my job. The boardroom was a cage made of glass and steel perched 40 stories above the city. It was a cold, quiet room that smelled of money and ambition. It was my son's world, but it had never been his home. I sat at the far end of a long black table that felt as cold as a tombstone with Frank beside me. He was a solid, quiet presence, a piece of old, reliable Detroit steel in this fragile glass box. At the head of the table, in the large leather chair that had once been David's, sat Jess. She was flanked by her lover Alistair Finch and a team of lawyers who looked like they were carved from the same expensive granite as the table. Jess wasn't pretending to be sad anymore. She was in command, her face sharp with triumph, her eyes glittering with a victor's light. She was a queen who had successfully staged a coup, and this was her coronation. The estate lawyer, a man named Davies, began to speak his voice, a dry rustle of legal papers. He droned on about bylaws and fiduciary duties, about the transfer of shares and assets. His words were the monotonous hum of a production line, each one a necessary step in assembling Jess's new empire. I watched her. She was barely listening to the words, only to the music they made, the triumphant sound of her plan coming to its perfect, profitable conclusion. Alistair sat beside her, a smug smile playing on his lips. They exchanged a brief knowing glance. They believed they had won. They believed the old man at the end of the table was nothing more than a piece of sentimental decoration, a final inconvenient detail to be managed before the real celebration could begin. Davies shuffled his papers and cleared his throat for the final proclamation. "And so," he announced, "pursuant to the final will and testament of David Henderson, and with the unanimous consent of the Emergency Board, I will now execute the formal transfer of all controlling shares, corporate assets, and intellectual property, including the proprietary algorithm known as Janus, to the designated heir and new Chief Executive Officer, Jessica Riley Henderson." He placed his fingers on his laptop, ready to enter the final command. The room was silent. This was the moment. The trigger. I pushed my chair back. The quiet scrape of its legs on the polished floor was as loud as a gunshot. Every head in the room turned towards me. "Excuse me," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it carried the weight of a man who had earned the right to speak. "Before we sign anything, there is one last thing." Jess's eyes narrowed. "Charles, please," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is hardly the time for emotional speeches." "This isn't a speech," I replied, my gaze locking with hers. "It's a final message from my son. I think the board has a right to see it." Alistair scoffed. "This is a legal proceeding, not a memorial service. We're not watching home movies." But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at Mr. Davies. "As the father of the founder," I said, letting the words hang in the air, "I believe it is my right to ensure his last wishes are honored." Davies squirmed. He was a man of procedure, and I had just presented him with one he couldn't ignore. "It is highly unusual," he stammered, "but I suppose there is no procedural harm." Jess was furious, but she was trapped. To refuse would look suspicious. With a sharp, angry wave of her hand, she gave her consent. Frank, moving with a quiet efficiency, stood and connected the encrypted hard drive to the room's main console. The giant screen on the wall, which had been displaying the company logo, went dark. Then it flickered to life. It was David's face. He was in his home office, the video clearly recorded weeks ago. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear and focused. He looked directly into the camera. He looked directly at us. "If you are watching this," my son began, his voice filling the silent room, "it means I am either missing or presumed dead, and it means my wife Jessica is attempting to take control of my company." A collective gasp went through the room. Jess's face turned to stone. The video continued. David calmly, methodically laid out the entire conspiracy. He showed copies of emails between Jess and Alistair, their affair, their plot to steal his work. He played audio recordings of their phone calls, their voices plotting to sell his life's work to the highest bidder. The smug expressions on the faces of their lawyers melted into slack-jawed horror. Jess and Alistair began shouting, "Turn it off! This is a fabrication! Turn it off now!" But no one moved. No one could look away. The truth, raw and undeniable, was holding them all hostage. Jess let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like glass breaking. "Fine," she said, waving a dismissive hand at Frank. "Let's watch the old man's home movie. Let's humor him and get this over with." She leaned back in her chair, the picture of arrogant indulgence. She thought she was granting a final, sentimental request. She had no idea she was signing her own confession. Frank nodded once, his face impassive, and connected the hard drive to the boardroom's console. The giant screen at the end of the room flickered to life. It wasn't a home movie. It was my son David staring out at us from his office, his face a mask of cold resolve. "If you are watching this," he began, his voice calm and clear, "it means my wife Jessica and her partner Alistair Finch are attempting to illegally seize control of my company." The smug smiles on their faces vanished. The video continued relentlessly, laying out their entire conspiracy with a chilling precision, complete with copies of their emails and audio of their treacherous phone calls. The room was silent except for my son's voice methodically dismantling their lies. Jess's face went from pale to ashen. Alistair shot to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "This is a deepfake. It's a fabrication. Shut it off!" he yelled at the lawyer. But as he shouted, the recorded video on the screen abruptly cut to black. For a single heart-stopping second, there was only silence. Then the screen lit up again. It wasn't the recording. It was a live feed. It was David, very much alive, sitting in a clean, sparse room, looking directly into the camera. He looked directly at them. "Hello, Jess. Hello, Alistair," he said, his voice echoing through the silent boardroom. "Surprised to see me?" A strangled gasp escaped Jess's lips. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. "By the way," David continued, a cold, hard edge to his voice, "when you instructed the lawyer to begin the asset transfer in this room, you triggered the final Janus security protocol. You sprang the trap yourselves." As he spoke, every screen in the room, the main monitor, their laptops, their phones, flashed a violent, pulsing red. 2 words appeared in huge block letters: "Access denied." Below them, a second line scrolled across the screen: "System lockdown initiated. Intellectual property secured permanently." David gave a sad, weary smile. "You can't steal what you can't touch," he said. "Checkmate." Meshu. At that exact moment, the sleek glass doors of the boardroom slid open. Frank, who had positioned himself by the door, held it open. 2 men and a woman in dark suits with FBI credentials entered the room, their movements calm and professional. The lead agent's eyes locked onto Jess and Alistair, who were frozen, their faces masks of pure, horrified disbelief. "Jessica Riley Alistair Finch," the agent said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You're under arrest." My son's face disappeared from the screen. He had done his part. I watched as they placed handcuffs on my daughter-in-law. Her 9-figure dream had just evaporated into the cold, sterile air of the room. The machine had finally and permanently broken down. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, methodical dismantling. The arrest in the boardroom was just the first gear in the great grinding machine of federal justice. For weeks, the story was everywhere. I'd see their faces on the evening news, Jess and Alistair stripped of their power suits, looking small and pale in court-issued jumpsuits. The news anchors used words like shocking conspiracy and high-stakes corporate espionage. They talked about the foiled plot to commit murder, the attempted theft of the Janus algorithm, and the web of lies built to support it all. The financial news channels had a field day analyzing the impact on the tech industry and the sheer audacity of the crime. I watched it all from the quiet of my living room, not with a sense of victory, but with a grim sense of finality. A faulty engine had been removed from the assembly line. The system, for all its flaws, had finally worked. The noise of the scandal was loud, but it was their noise, not mine. I would turn off the television, and the silence that followed felt clean like the air after a thunderstorm. The public chapter of this story was closing, and justice was being served line by line in the cold black and white text of legal filings. The news cycle moves on. The headlines fade, replaced by new scandals and new tragedies. But for me and David, the real work had just begun. It wasn't work that made the news. It took place in the quiet, greasy sanctuary of my garage. A few months after the arrests, David started coming over on Saturdays just like he used to. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't dissect the betrayal or the fear. We didn't need to. The words would have been clumsy, inadequate tools for the job. Instead, we worked. We pulled the tarp off of Project 68, and we got our hands dirty. Our conversations were a language of metal and mechanics. Hand me the 3/8 wrench. Did you check the gap on that spark plug? The timing on this distributor is off by a hair. We spoke about carburetors and gaskets, about rust and primer. Each tightened bolt was an affirmation of our bond. Each cleaned part was a piece of the past being made right. The shared unspoken rhythm of our work was its own form of communication. It was a trust that went deeper than words, a respect built on the shared knowledge of how to fix what is broken. In the quiet hum of the workshop, surrounded by the smell of oil and old steel, a father and son were being rebuilt piece by painstaking piece. We didn't need to talk about forgiveness or healing. We were building it right there with our own two hands. One Saturday, we were hunched over the engine block, a great heavy heart of iron resting on a stand. David was struggling to align a difficult part. He was frustrated, ready to force it. I put my hand on his shoulder. He stopped. I pointed with a grease-stained finger at the complex assembly. Sometimes, I said, my voice quiet, you can't just fix the one broken piece. You have to take the whole thing apart. You have to clean every gear, every piston, every single valve. You have to understand how they all work together. Only then, when you put it all back, does it run better than it ever did before. He looked at me, then back at the engine. He understood. He wasn't just my son. He was my partner. And together we were looking at the engine of our family, a complex and beautiful machine that had been stripped down to its foundations, ready to be rebuilt stronger than ever. This story illustrates the crucial distinction between inheritance and legacy. Inheritance is what you leave to someone: assets, money, property. It is tangible and can be stolen or squandered. Legacy, however, is what you leave in someone: wisdom, character, and the strength to discern truth from deception. While the antagonists chased a fleeting inheritance, the father and son were bound by a legacy of trust and practical intelligence. In the end, it is not the wealth we accumulate, but the values we instill that serve as our greatest defense and our most enduring monument. This story illustrates the crucial distinction between inheritance and legacy. Inheritance is what you leave to someone: assets, money, property. It is tangible and can be stolen or squandered. Legacy, however, is what you leave in someone: wisdom, character, and the strength to discern truth from deception. While the antagonists chased a fleeting inheritance, the father and son were bound by a legacy of trust and practical intelligence. In the end, it is not the wealth we accumulate, but the values we instill that serve as our greatest defense and our most enduring monument. If you believe a parent's instinct is never wrong and enjoyed this story of justice, please like this video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments about a time you trusted your gut feeling.